Hello, everybody. My name is Andrea Scrima. I'm sorry I can't be there today. I've been a bit sick, and so this is why I'm recording an excerpt from a novel in progress that in part has to do with the Arbëresh diaspora in New York City, specifically the Bronx, the beginning of the 20th century. I kept telling myself that I wasn't really all that interested in genealogy. But then I remembered the old Albanian community in the Bronx. Uncle Louis had told me about at my father's funeral. It was the first time I'd heard anything about it. He'd read an article in the paper, he said. It might interest me, he said. A few days later, he photocopied it and sent it to me in the mail, and then it slipped into the mess of papers on my desk and the unfinished business of life, and I forgot about it. Suddenly it was as though the seed he'd planted so many years ago had finally germinated, and I found myself wondering about my grandfather Luigi's origins. I sensed a sliver of something an aunt had told me many years ago glinting for a moment somewhere in the obscurity of not quite recollection. It was a rhyme she'd learned by heart in childhood and recited for me once in a kind of sing-song her father had taught her as a mnemonic to pass on his place of birth, so that she would know and not forget, and maybe, it occurs to me now, one day return. Had he made my father memorize it as well? But I no longer remembered the words, and in any case, I could no longer ask her because she too had been dead for many years. Her sons had no memory of it, but another cousin of mine recalled the name, Grecci, and pointed me to a website devoted to the tiny village in Campania, which by an incredible stroke of luck listed the birth and death dates going back to the early 1600s of everyone who'd ever lived there. Sixth and seventh cousins twice removed, because everyone with forebears from Grecci is in one way or another related, had compiled the information over years of research in the municipal archives in Naples and in the christening and baptism records of the local church, photographing and transcribing thousands of pages of names and dates, and entering them into indexed databases. Suddenly, the past was no longer as unreachable as it had seemed only an hour before, and I was able to trace Luigi's lineage back 12 generations in an Arbëresh village settled by ethnic Albanians in what was then the Kingdom of Naples. I stared at the screen. It was as though I'd stumbled through a mirror and found myself in another dimension. I had a great-great-great-great-great-grandmother named Siblia Scrima. I knew the year she was born and the year she died. Presumably, I carried nucleotides of her DNA in my body. But what was I supposed to do with this information? My father had never been to Italy. He'd never, in fact, stepped foot in an airplane. He traveled outside the New York City area only once when he was in the Coast Guard. His generation was expected to blend in and become American, whatever the cost, because for all its clinging to cultural identity, and this is its paradox, the immigrant experience of the 19th and early 20th centuries was one of repression, of amputation. I'd been told, and subsequently forgot, that my grandfather had spoken an old Albanian dialect. Now I was learning that his family went back at least 400 years in Grecci di Puglia, today a province of Avellino, and that they called it by its Arbëresh name, Katundi. And after a full day of typing names and numbers, I had a family tree as far as the official records go. They were astonishingly complete, and they revealed that the small Arbëresh community Luigi came from had intermarried within the circle of its own and nearby Arbëresh villages, all the Poppas, Gliatas, Morenas, and Stradas for centuries. At the age of 23, hoping to escape the poverty that had been strangling southern Italy in the wake of the country's unification, Luigi boarded the SS Bolivia from the port of Naples, together with 8 other young men from Grecci. I'd found them in a digitized collection of ship manifests from the time. Luigi's passenger ID number was 102-736-150-560. His ticket number 419. The trip across the Atlantic took 3 weeks. When he arrived at Ellis Island on March 14, 1902, he gave his occupation as shoemaker. He had $10 cash in his pocket, as did most of those arriving. Word had evidently spread about what to do and say to the immigration authorities. After having been judged by both the captain and the ship's surgeon not to be an idiot or insane person, or a pauper, or likely to become a public charge, or suffering from a loathsome or dangerous contagious disease, or a person who has been convicted of a felony or other infamous crime or misdemeanor involving moral turpitude, or a polygamist, end quote, he went to stay with his mother's brother Leonardo, who resided at 529 East 149th Street in the Bronx, 2 doors down from where he would eventually occupy a 2-room apartment after marrying my grandmother. Luigi's mother, Maria Luisa, traveled on the SS Trojan Prince and arrived on March 11, 1903, 1 year after her son. On the ship manifest, she is listed, as is Grecci custom, under her maiden name, Morena. Many of her nieces and nephews were emigrating. They were part of a growing wave of younger people leaving the village, and the passenger lists are filled with them. Grecci was being abandoned by the droves, and it was all I could do to resist the temptation to look up the Ellis Island records of all of Luigi's cousins and cousins' cousins, because I was beginning to suspect that half of Grecci had relocated to the Bronx, and that everyone was, of course, in one way or another, related. Excuse me. Until the Emergency Quota Act was passed in 1921, the year my father was born, 4,000 to 5,000 individuals had passed through Ellis Island each day. Immigration officials complained that it was impossible to adequately question or inspect each passenger. Registry clerks were poorly paid and trained and generally didn't speak the languages of the people they were hired to assess. Inspectors boarded the ships to perform a cursory examination of first and second class passengers, but steerage passengers were herded onto barges and brought to a separate station where they filed past the scrutinizing gaze of public health service officers. There was an abundance of trachoma and favus among Italian immigrants, infectious diseases of the eye and scalp. These were grounds for immediate deportation. Inspectors used button hooks to turn back the eyelids of anyone with visible symptoms. Among the conditions screened for, apart from visible infirmity, were epilepsy, mental illness, and moral degeneracy, including homosexuality. For each passenger, uniformed military surgeons had an average of 6 seconds to perform a brief inspection and marked in chalk the coats of those singled out for a more thorough medical examination. My father told us so little. He told us nothing, really. As I searched for clues, in some vague way I felt as though I were stealing something. My research was clandestine. Squint. I was doing something I somehow sensed he wouldn't have approved of. His was the task of being American. This was the imperative, and not the son of an Albanian-Italian immigrant shouting out the names of frutta e verdura as he pushed his cart through the streets of the neighborhood. Or would he have shouted out the words in Arbëresh? Would my father have recognized the words tata and meme, father and mother? Was he even curious? I entered the word Arbëresh in the YouTube search and happened upon Grecci locals interviewing a New York politician of Arbëresh descent who'd visited the village as part of a campaign to foster intercultural understanding between the congressional district he represented and the sizable Albanian influx that had settled there in the 1990s, in large part from Kosovo. The man was in his 80s, but his New York accent was younger than the throaty intonations my father and his siblings spoke in, sounds that made my heart sing and that belonged to a vanished past. Describing his earliest memories of the Bronx, throughout which he'd always, as most of Luigi's children bafflingly did, assumed that his parents and aunts and uncles were speaking an Italian dialect. The congressman recalled that farther north, along Gun Hill Road, people from the Arbëresh community kept small makeshift farms with sheep and goats amid the scrap metal and piles of used lumber, and sold goat's milk and homemade kashkavar, and that his father took him there to taste the flavors of his own childhood. The Arbëreshi were descended from soldiers, many of whom had already migrated in earlier centuries to Greece and had served the kingdoms of Naples and Venice. They were short and stocky and accustomed to heavy labor, and they lived in mountain-top villages from which they could survey the landscape and identify invading forces from afar. The Arbëreshi were stubborn and often belligerent. They'd survived centuries of occupation by the French, Spanish, and dozens of feudal lords, and had seen their sons hauled away to fight in foreign wars. They'd endured in southern Italy for close to 600 years, but after they began emigrating in the late 19th century, more than half their population became depleted within a few decades, even as their American relatives thrived, because in spite of the poverty of inner-city life and their superstitious fear of medical doctors, the inoculations mandated by the U.S. government dramatically reduced infant mortality. Their children survived and grew, and better nourished than their parents were soon towering over them. I wondered if Maria Louisa adapted to the new world, or if she grew tired of being alive. In any case, the prosperity they dreamed of never materialized. My grandfather sold vegetables and fruit from a cart that he pushed through the streets of the Bronx. He, his wife, and his 9 children lived in a 2-room cold-water flat, but by the time he was in his late 50s, he was worn out. The Italian philosopher Ernesto Di Martino wrote about a crisis of presence that afflicts ethnic minorities in diaspora, and observed that among southern Italian peasants, emigration was regarded as a form of death. I tried to imagine leaving a village like Grecci, perched on a hill in the upper Cerbero Valley, flanking the Apennines, and surrounded by a panorama of plains stretching out to the distant horizon, and relocating to the stifling tenements of the Bronx. The Arbëresh word hora means more than just country or homeland. It implies a link to community and everything that is familiar and loved and known, and it's untranslatable. How do they cope with the loss? When I considered the abundance of mental illness in my father's family, schizophrenia and depression had afflicted several of his siblings, I wondered about the psychological effects of permanent dislocation and whether it was possible that some echo of this loss had been passed down to Luigi's children. The majority of Grecci's immigrants moved to the same boroughs and the same neighborhoods to remain together. Often they moved to the same street and even the same building. From the 1890s on, for at least 50 years, a play centered around San Bartolomeo, Grecci's patron saint, was reenacted in the Bronx and other Grecci communities in New York and Ohio. When I thought of his intimidating figure in Michelangelo's Last Judgment, riding a cloud to the right of Jesus Christ, When I thought of my son and I gazing at the back wall of the Sistine Chapel and at Bartolomeo gripping the full cloak of his flayed skin with his left hand and the instrument of his martyrdom, a knife, in his right, it struck me that the loss of one's own skin, nakedness taken to the extreme, a body stripped down to its very flesh, was an apt metaphor for the immigrant's vulnerability in an alien and hostile environment. Thank you, and enjoy the conference. Bye-bye.